We're going to be back in the book of Daniel, chapter number 29. For those that aren't here, they'll miss out on the best bits. So we're going to pick up from verse number 24. Gabriel tells Daniel, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, we looked at this every which way last week, and I hope you looked at it over the last week, because there's just so much going on in verse 24, and we just didn't have time to break it down completely. But you'll remember from last week that there were a couple of words that I didn't even touch. I jumped right over them and went straight to the word determined. And this week I want to start with those words and start to break those down. So the two words that I purposely stayed away from were two words which were really the key to understanding what is going on, to understand Gabriel's message to Daniel. Now I want you to notice the first two words, 70 weeks. In the Hebrew, this is what they look like. In the Hebrew, and when you read it, it goes from right to left. It is Shavuim and Shivim. Now the word translated as Shavuim in the Hebrew does not mean weeks. It is not 70 weeks. It means 7 or 7 times. Literally, this reads 7 times 70. We would say 70 times 7, because we do it the other way around. But in the Hebrew, it is 7 times 70. Now, the thing that Gabriel does not specify is the units. The English has been translated as 70 weeks, and so we think in terms of 7 days. But Gabriel doesn't say 70 weeks, he says 7 times 70, and he doesn't say what the units are. He doesn't say it's 70 days, 70 weeks, 70 months, or he doesn't even specify 70 years. He simply states 70 sevens, or 7 times 70. And so whenever you see a term like this in the Hebrew, and it's an equivalent to us in the English saying a dozen, it's a dozen of something. So when you see it in the Hebrew like this, you need to define the length of time, the unit of measure, from the context, from the verses around it. Now I'm tell you straight up, I believe that this phrase of 70 sevens, or 7 times 70, is referring to years, weeks of years. So 7 times 70 is 490. I believe Gabriel is talking about 490 years. But how can we be sure? Well, Daniel's mind was already thinking in terms of years. If you go back up to verse number 2 in chapter 9, Daniel says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years. Notice that. Number of years. Where the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. So Daniel learned, and we studied this when we looked at the prayer, that the Israelites were to go into 70 years of captivity for their rebellion and for their sin against God. So here in verse 2, Daniel reads from Jeremiah that the captivity was going to be for 70 years, so his mind was already thinking in terms of years. And a few verses later, Gabriel comes and tells him that 77s, or 7 times 70, I believe that Daniel would have automatically thought in terms of years. You see, I think God is playing on words here, and it's a little bit like Jesus when he says, when he gets asked, how often should I forgive my brother? Daniel was thinking, Lord, 70 years and our captivity is over. 70 years and Israel will be restored to her glory, and her people will be restored to their glory. And in a sense, God is saying correct, but in another sense, he's like, no, that's incorrect, because God tells him not 70 years, but 7 times 70. There is a greater period of time frame that I'm talking about. So in context, Daniel would have been thinking in terms of 70 years, 70 times 7, 490 years. God tells Daniel that there would be a restoration to the land after the 70 years of captivity, that the people would return to Jerusalem, the temple would be rebuilt, and the city would be rebuilt. But he'd also determined, and we looked at that word, cut out a period of time, 490 years, when sin would be dealt with and everlasting righteousness brought in. Now, before we move on, I want to share something that you may have missed, but something that I noticed that just really, I was like, whoa, that's amazing. So God is dealing with the sevens here in Daniel. He's playing with the 70 years, 70 weeks, 70 units of seven. And this is where it all gets really interesting. From his prayer, we know that Daniel understood the reason for the captivity. They had rebelled and they'd been disobedient. In particular, they had consistently violated the 7-year Sabbath. They had become greedy, self-indulgent, and materialistic. They worked the land 6 years, and instead of resting it on the 7th year to restore the land, they continued to plough it. And this pattern of the 7-year Sabbath follows, the days of creation, where God created in 6 days, and on the 7th he rested. And they kept violating this Sabbath year of rest year after year. And that is one of the reasons why they were removed from the land, because God wanted to give the land its proper Sabbath rest. As a nation, they had violated 70 Sabbaths. And so that was the number that God set for the captivity. He said, you guys owe me 70 Sabbaths. And he said, I gave you the instructions. I gave you the commandments. And I did it because it was for your good. The land needed to rest, to recuperate, to recover, so that they could then plow it back into crops. So God tells Daniel, your people would not let the land rest when they were in it, so I'm going to remove them from it so that the land can rest. God said, you wouldn't let the land rest, you wouldn't do it when I told you to do it, so now I'm going to make you do it. I'm going to make the land rest. 2 Chronicles 36, verse 21 says, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, talking about the captivity, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbath, for as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. And how long is 70 years? That's 70 years. So here is the tremendous truth. God says you're going to stay out of the land for 70 years so it can rest. I'm getting back my Sabbaths. How many Sabbaths do you need to violate to equate to 70 years of captivity? Now, I know it's Sunday morning, and everybody's mind's like, mush. So you simply multiply 70 years by 7 and you get 490. Or in other words, another way, you take 490 and divide it by 70 years and you get sevens. You know, you go backwards if you want to do it that way. But basically, they violated 70 Sabbaths. And it takes 490 years to get to 70 Sabbaths. So this shows the love, mercy of God, the patience of God. You know, he waited for nearly 500 years before he punished them and put them into captivity. God is telling them, firstly, you owe me 70 Sabbaths, so you're going into captivity. But more than that, he's saying you violated the Sabbath for 490 years. So 490 years will be determined upon your history. That will be the section that I cut out to accomplish my will and bring in the millennial reign and the everlasting kingdom of Christ. Remember, last week we looked in verse 24 where he said 70 weeks have been determined, are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. You remember that God had cut out a period of time to deal with sin, to end the transgressions, you know, and establish an everlasting righteousness. But note the amount of time was 70 weeks, or 7 times 70, or 490 years. God used their 490 years of rebellion to pass judgment. And I just think that just shows the amazing God that we serve, the Almighty God, that he put them into captivity for 70 years, but then he went on further and said part of that judgment is 490 years until Israel gets restored to its former glory, you know. And I just think that's an amazing fact. I also remember that if we looked at this early on, that if plain sense makes good sense, then seek no other sense. So to say that the events described in Daniel chapter number 9, verses 24 to 27, occurred in 490 days or 490 weeks or 490 months makes no sense. It's nonsense from the context. And if you go back to some of the older commentaries, conservative commentaries, they all interpret it as years. Now the next thing we need to establish, now that we understand that when we read in chapter 9 verse 24, 70 weeks, that we're talking about 490 years, we need to understand the length of those years. And this all becomes relevant shortly. How long are those years? If I was to ask you how long was how many days are in a year, you're probably going to say to me, well, it's 365. And if you said that, well, you'd be wrong. Because the system of keeping time in the Old Testament was based on the lunar cycle, not the solar cycle. The lunar cycle played a significant role in the culture and the religious life in ancient Israel. So they would count. So time would be counted by the cycle of the moon, would be recorded or tracked by the cycle of the moon. The Hebrew lunar calendar contained 12 months of 30 days in big round numbers. The actual number of days in the month would have been 29 and a half days, which would have resulted in a 354 and a half day year. Keeping the lunar calendar coordinated with the seasons of the year required adding a 13-month roughly every 3 years. So every 3 years in the Old Testament they had a leap year, and they added another month, and they added it. The last month in the Hebrew calendar is the month Adar, and so when it was a leap year, it was Adar 1, and then the next month was Adar 2. So they just added another Adar. And in case you want proof of the month's been 30 days, and you need to hang on because we will get there. According to Genesis, the flood in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, the flood began on the 17th day of the second month. The flood came to an end on the 17th day of the 7th month. So 2nd month it started, 7th month it ended. So by my calculation, that's a 5-month period. Now I know you're saying, well, what's so interesting about that? In Genesis chapter 7, verse 24, and in Genesis 8, verse 3, the Bible tells us that the flood lasted for 150 days. Now, if the flood was 150 days, and the Jews counted that as 5 months, how long were the months? They have to be 30 days. 12 30-day months equals 360 days a year. So the Jews functioned on a 360-day calendar. The earliest known months recorded in the Bible used 30 days, 30-day months, which gives you a 360-day year. Now, once in a while, they threw in the leap year just to keep everything on track. There's another proof. When you read Daniel 7, where it talks about the Great Tribulation, it tells us that the tribulation will last for a time, 1, times, plural, 2, and a half. Times, and half a time, or 3.5 years. Revelation 13 tells us that the tribulation will last for 42 months. In Revelation 12, verse 6 tells us the tribulation will last for 1,260 days. Now this is interesting because we've got 3 different time frames. One place it says 3.5 years, one place it says 42 months, and another place it says 1,260 days. Folks, 3.5 years is equal to 42 months. But if 42 months equals 1,260 days, then they need to be 30-day months. There's no other way. So again, from Revelations, or from Genesis to Revelations, it is clear that the Bible is counting months as 30 days. So Daniel would have used the same biblical calendar. He would have used 490 years of 360 days. The next thing we need to understand is, when did the period begin? We need to understand how long the days, months were, the years were. So when we get a starting point, we know where the ending point is. Look at verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. Notice Gabriel tells Daniel that the 70 weeks begins from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. This is key to understand the interpretation of this entire passage, and obviously begins the critical determinant as to when the countdown begins. Gabriel says it begins right at the commandment to restore and to rebuild. So all we have to do is find a commandment in the Bible to restore and to rebuild, and then we're able to calculate the dates. The problem is there's at least 4 to rebuild, and there's even 1 to stop rebuilding. So which one is the right one? The book of Ezra gives us 4. 1 by Cyrus, 1 by Darius, and 1 by Artaxerxes I. And then another, and 1 by Artaxerxes, and then there's a second decree by Artaxerxes. Now, which one starts the countdown? Because they're all given on different dates. And if you start at a different date, you're going to end up at a different time. You're going to end up at the wrong time. Now, before we get into the dates and all this calculation and everything, I want to put a disclaimer out. I share these dates as a matter of interest and not as a matter of fact. We need to remember that we're dealing with iniquity, and therefore, antiquity, get the right word, very different, antiquity, and therefore there's some error. There'll be some error. And I'm not trying to calculate this is when Jesus is coming or anything like that. I'm sharing this out of interest because it is rather interesting. So don't take it as fact to say, Pastor John said, this is the date, because I will flatly deny it. So I'm going to share the cut down version because we don't have the time. There is a guy way back in the early 1900s who was a Scottish guy. He worked for Scotland Yard. So he was a policeman, used to dealing with trying to track down mysteries and that. And he spent, when he retired, he spent a few years sifting through all of the Bible and getting all the dates and working everything out. And it is pages and pages of calculations of this BC minus that plus the leap year. And I was thinking, I'm going to spare you guys from all of that calculation. I just skimmed over it and I was like, man, this hurts my brain. So we'll do the cut down version. So there's 4 royal decrees listed and are usually considered when trying to determine the correct starting point. And I actually was always referred to one of them and have realized as I've studied through it that I wasn't looking at the right one. So even I learned something. So the first decree issued in 538 BC was the one concern issued by Cyrus, and that was concerning the rebuilding of the temple. The second was the decree of Darius I in 520 BC, which that decree was actually a confirmation of the first decree. It talks about, and Daniel talks about rebuilding in troublous times. And when you read Ezra and Nehemiah, from the moment they started rebuilding the temple, they had nothing but trouble from those people that had moved into Israel and the surrounding nations. And so they were always trying to stop the rebuilding process. So Cyrus issues the first command, says, go rebuild the temple. And then people stir up some trouble, and Darius issues another decree that says, no, they can keep building the temple. The third decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus in 457 BC related to the finances for animal sacrifices of the temple. Now these 3 say nothing about building the city itself. They solely deal with rebuilding the temple. And since Gabriel said that it goes forth from the decree or the commandment to rebuild the city, we don't take those ones into consideration. The 4th decree by Artaxerxes issued on March the 4th, 444 BC, in Nehemiah 2, he granted the Jews specific authorization to rebuild Jerusalem's city walls. This decree is the one which closely fits the specific requirements of Daniel 9:25. Look again at verse 25. On the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince. Notice the word unto. That can be translated until. And it's an important word which marks a change of time. It signifies that up to the time that, or up to the point in time or the event mentioned, or up to a stipulated time. In this case, it's up to the time, up to the point, up to the event where Messiah the Prince appears. However, notice the time frame laid out by Gabriel. He says, from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. So we have 2 time periods dividing dividing this time period, this 490 years. First, we have a time period of 7 weeks, and then we have a time period of 62 weeks, which totals 69 weeks. Okay? So 70 weeks, and we're accounting for 69 weeks. So there's another week to come. Now, the first 7 weeks is a 49-year period. And verse 25 indicates that that's the time when the city shall be built again, the streets shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. And as I said before, if you study the book of Nehemiah, you find out very quickly that they built the temple, the wall, the city with a lot of opposition. You can read, and that was done over that 49-year period. And you can read that in Ezra 9 and Ezra 10, Nehemiah 4, Nehemiah 6, and Nehemiah chapter number 9. Following the decree, the Jewish people endured some troublous times as they rebuilt their homeland, despite severe opposition from other groups in Judea, and completed it roughly around 395 BC. And again, give or take. So the decree was issued in 444 BC, and 49 years later, you have 395 BC. And by the way, it says in verse 25, in those 49 years, the streets would be built and the wall. The actual word for street is the word for a public square or a marketplace. It's not a street as we would think of a street like this. It's talking about the public square or the marketplace. And the wall is talking about an external fortification. It actually is more closely assigned to the word ditch or moat. And you think of a castle with a moat or a ditch to protect it, but it's actually talking about fortification. So we're talking about the outside wall that they used to protect the city. The next 62 weeks then awaits the return of the Messiah. After rebuilding of Jerusalem, Daniel's prophecy anticipates Messiah the Prince, a Hebrew phrase associated with kingly authority. So it's Jesus, it's the Messiah, the King, we would say. In the New Testament, or in Jesus' New Testament existence on the earth, the one time that he appeared as a king, and you remember that throughout his ministry when they tried to crown him as king, when they tried to set him up as the ruler, he always said, "My time is not yet, my time is not yet." And he would disappear and the crowd would be like, "Where is he?" He would just blend in and just walk off and go somewhere else. But there is one time that he appeared as the king, as the rightful ruler, and that is at the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where he rode on the back of a donkey. They laid palm tree branches down on the ground and hailed him as, it said, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." That's the day when the people recognized him as their king and praised him as such. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. So starting from 4th of March, 44 BC, we can calculate that the date of Christ's triumphant entry would be around the end of March, AD 33, which would then be followed by his crucifixion in April, AD 33. Again, I do not present these dates as fact, but as a matter of interest, because it shows that when you do the calculations, we're in the same ballpark. We're in the same ballpark of when Jesus' ministry was around, give or take a few years. And I don't need the dates to build my faith, but it does build my faith to realize that God's word is faithful. That you can do the calculations and you're in the ballpark. God told Daniel the very day Jesus would enter the city of Jerusalem, when his people would declare Hosanna to the King of David, the Messiah. But you know what? It didn't last long. Look at verse 26. And after this, and after the 762 weeks, shall Messiah be what? Be cut off. And we'll look at what that means next week.